In the Middle Ages, the concept of divine judgment formed the foundation of certain legal practices. Chief among them was the ordeal, a physical test believed to reveal innocence or guilt through God's intervention. For pregnant women accused of adultery, fornication, or unlawful conception, this method was applied with brutal simplicity. One of the most well-documented ordeals was the ordeal of boiling water, described in detail in the 9th century legal codes of the Carolingian Empire and later in canon law. The accused was ordered to retrieve a ring or stone from a pot of boiling water. Her hand would then be bandaged for 3 days. If it healed cleanly, she was declared innocent. If it festered, guilty. This method was especially cruel for pregnant women. The physical trauma, combined with malnutrition, made many miscarry or suffer fatal infections. Yet legal authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, accepted this outcome as the will of God. Sometimes the ordeal involved carrying red-hot iron. The woman had to walk a set distance holding a glowing bar of iron. If her burned hands healed cleanly, she was vindicated. If not, punishment followed swiftly, ranging from flogging to lifelong confinement. In a society where honor was weighed more heavily than compassion, pregnant women were not spared the full brutality of medieval superstition. The outcome of an ordeal was never truly in their hands. It was left to the fire, the water, and the silence of the church. Branded as adulterers in public squares. Imagine a pregnant woman, exposed, trembling, bound to a wooden post in the village square. The crowd watches, silent, as the executioner lifts a red-hot branding iron. In one swift motion, her skin is scorched with a permanent mark, the physical stain of adultery. This was not fiction. In parts of medieval Europe, public branding was a sanctioned punishment for women accused of moral transgressions, especially when pregnancy made their guilt visible. Throughout the High and Late Middle Ages, laws across Christian Europe treated women's moral conduct as a matter of public morality and social order. When pregnancy occurred outside of marriage, it served as visible evidence of moral failing, and often legal guilt. Local courts and ecclesiastical authorities responded with punishments that combined shame, pain, and public display. In regions of France, the customary laws of Normandy and Brittany recorded that women accused of adultery could be branded on the forehead or cheek with hot iron. This was a method used to permanently mark their supposed moral corruption. These laws were influenced by Roman legal traditions, where branding, stigma, had long served as a punishment for perceived moral offences among enslaved or lower-class women. In 13th century England, ecclesiastical courts dealt with many cases of fornication, especially when a woman was found pregnant without a husband. While branding was less common in England than on the continent, public penance was standard. This often included walking barefoot through town wearing a white sheet, sometimes with a rope around the neck, while confessing the sin aloud, recorded in archdeaconry court rolls from places like York and London. Yet in the Holy Roman Empire, especially in German-speaking regions, branding remained a lawful punishment for adultery and premarital pregnancy well into the 15th century. Theologians, such as Thomas Aquinas, justified such punishments as necessary to preserve divine order. In his Summa Theologiae, he argued that sins of the flesh are especially shameful, not because they are the gravest, but because they degrade reason, the highest faculty of the soul, by subjecting it to bodily desire. Though the pleasure is fleeting, the disorder it leaves in the soul, he warned, is enduring. In the Middle Ages, the body of a pregnant woman could become a public battleground for honor, discipline, and collective morality. Branding was not just a physical scar, it was a message, burned into the skin, that the community's laws were etched in flesh as much as parchment. Flagellation for forbidden pregnancies. Flagellation as public penance has its roots in Christian monastic discipline, but became widespread in secular and ecclesiastical courts by the 12th century, especially in Western Christendom. When a woman was found to be pregnant outside wedlock, her offence was considered both a moral crime and a visible disruption of the Christian social order. Since the pregnancy itself was considered undeniable proof of fornication, she was often punished without any further evidence or trial. In medieval England, records from the York ecclesiastical courts describe cases where women accused of fornication, especially when pregnant, were sentenced to public penance, often involving barefoot processions in symbolic garments. Similar practices appear in the consistory court records of Ely and Exeter, where penitent women walked through their parish on holy days, confessing their sin before the congregation. These rituals were designed to maximize public shame and reinforce moral discipline through corporal punishment, like whipping was more typical of secular courts. The Church defended such practices as spiritually corrective. Peter Damian, an 11th century reforming cardinal, argued that bodily suffering was a small price to pay for the salvation of the soul. In his writings, he promoted flagellation as a form of penance, believing that disciplining the flesh could prevent eternal damnation, a view that drew direct parallels to Christ's own scourging. Pregnant women, however, bore a double burden. Not only were their bodies punished, but they were also condemned as corrupting both themselves and the unborn. In medieval society, forbidden pregnancy wasn't treated with compassion. It was met with the lash, each strike meant to cleanse the soul, but in truth it exposed a system where women's bodies were arenas for pain, shame, and coerced penitence. Imprisoned in monastic cells until birth. Behind the heavy wooden doors of medieval convents, not all who entered did so voluntarily. For pregnant women accused of moral misconduct, especially nuns who broke their vows or unmarried women from respectable families, monastic imprisonment was a common sentence. These confinements were not spiritual retreats, but punitive isolations where silence, austerity, and confinement replaced lashes. By the 12th century, across Western Europe, families and local authorities sometimes placed women who conceived outside of marriage into convents or monastic cells, seeking to contain scandal and enforce moral discipline. While not always a formal court sentence, this form of enforced seclusion served to preserve public morality and remove the woman from further temptation, reflecting the Church's growing concern with regulating moral behavior and social order. Following the Gregorian reforms of the late 11th century, the Church intensified its control over clerical and monastic conduct. If a nun became pregnant, it was seen as a grave violation of her vow of chastity. In some cases, she could be confined within her convent, sometimes for life, as a form of spiritual punishment and containment. While the Council of London, 1102, emphasized harsh penance for moral transgressions among clergy, the specifics of punishment often varied by region and ecclesiastical authority. But this practice extended beyond religious women. In regions like Flanders, northern France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, local authorities sometimes ordered pregnant, unmarried women, especially those from merchant or noble families, to be locked in monastic cells until childbirth. This was not primarily for health or protection, but to prevent public disgrace and ensure the child could later be sent away or placed in anonymity. Conditions in monastic confinement could be harsh. Women sent to Benedictine or Cistercian communities for penance, especially after moral scandal, were often housed in austere cells, given meagre rations, and subjected to daily prayers and silence. In some cases, especially in northern France, women were confined until childbirth, after which the child might be sent to a foundling home or religious institution. Church officials justified this isolation as a mercy, protection from shame, temptation, or sin. But in reality, It served to control women's bodies and suppress the consequences of what society deemed immoral behavior. Banished from villages for sinful pregnancies. No trial, no appeal, just a cold directive from the village elders or parish priest. Leave and do not return. For many pregnant women in the Middle Ages, especially those without a husband or social protection, banishment was not just a threat, it was policy. Being visibly pregnant out of wedlock could mean total expulsion from one's home, often under threat of excommunication or corporal punishment if they defied the order. This practice was widespread across late medieval Europe, particularly in smaller rural communities where Christian moral order was deeply tied to local reputation. Inhabitants were expected to conform to a strict social code, and an unmarried pregnant woman represented both a spiritual and communal disruption. In medieval England, manorial court rolls occasionally record cases where unmarried pregnant women faced social penalties, including public penance, fines, or even banishment from the village. In regions like Norfolk and Suffolk, such women were often treated as having forfeited their moral standing in the community. In medieval society, exile functioned not only as punishment but as erasure. A sinful pregnancy made a woman untouchable, her body deemed incompatible with the moral structure of village life. In banishment, she vanished, out of sight, out of memory, and outside the protection of the very community that once called her its own. Through forced trials, public shaming, and exile, medieval societies inflicted profound suffering on pregnant women, revealing how law, religion, and communal fear could converge to punish bodies and crush spirits. These brutal practices did more than punish. They reinforced power and silenced vulnerability. History's harshest judgments still echo today in debates about autonomy and justice. As St. Jerome warned, virginity can be lost by a thought.